Okay, hello everyone. Thanks for coming. Before I go with the formalities, Malta is no longer a frontline state. When we were thinking of organizing this debate, the theme we had been asked to consider was Malta as a frontline state. Is the European Union abandoning frontline states? And our thought was that's not really a relevant discussion nowadays because Malta isn't a frontline state anymore. Ever since Mare Nostrum was launched by the Italian government, boats more or less started declining and then eventually stopped completely coming to Malta. And that phenomenon, the more spectacular phenomenon of irregular migration stopped. And with it, I think the sting from the debate on migration was removed. There's much less hysteria about the debate on migration nowadays, which I think is a good thing. But at the same time, I think we've lost in the process some of the vigor of discussing the challenges of migration, which remain, and the opportunities of migration. Also because in the process, migration didn't really stop. So in the past 3 years, 4 years, we still received many refugees, some migrants, and many legal migrants as well from the European Union. I think it's safe to say that Malta is more diverse today than it was even 5 years ago, let alone 10, 15, or 20 years ago. And all this brings challenges. So that's what we're here to discuss today. This is an initiative which is part of a wider European initiative by Debating Europe called Cities and Refugees. It's being co-organized by the Migrant Network and leading talks. So with me today, I'm very happy. Unfortunately, one of the panelists had a problem. He might join us later from the Sudanese Migrants Association. To my left, there's Silvana Jus, who is director, I'm looking for the whole title, of the Directorate of Human Rights and Integration within the Social Dialogue Ministry. The title is actually much longer, but I'll limit to that. Who is the most important thing, he's overseeing the drafting of Malta's first integration policy. On the extreme right, not politically, is Dr. Maria Pizzani. She's a senior lecturer at university and one of the co-founders of the Integra Foundation, and one of the people who was most involved in this area from the very beginning. So she's been very active since the very beginning, since the phase actually where Malta saw a pendulum response to migration and the debate really reached or almost reached a tipping point. To my right is Mohamed Hassan from Spark 15, Malta's very first grassroots youth refugee organization. So with that sort of introduction, I'd like to kick off with the starting point, which is I would like this discussion as much as possible to be a broad discussion also about the conviviality of the native population, the local population, and the migrant population seen as broadly. So my first question, Mohammed, is to you. As someone who has been living in Malta for a while now, and is doing an effort to integrate, you're in the educational system, you have plans for the future. How do you view Malta? How do you see Malta treating you? How do you view the condition of migrants in Malta in general, migrants and refugees seen broadly?
Well, well, the scene has been changed since 2011, since I arrived in Malta. It was totally different 5 years ago, comparing to nowadays. There was like less youth refugees who's thinking of even studying. Everyone, I remember in 2011 till 14, everybody used to think of rather leaving Malta or just getting out of the open center. Now, most of the youth, fortunately, they're thinking of getting their higher education and staying and do something good for Malta.
Mhm. I think this is a very important change to note, and in a sense, this is good news in the sense that Malta was always seen as a transit country, a place where people land here, they're sort of in a temporary limbo, and they're planning to go. What do you think brought about this change, Silva?
I think Malta was never the transit country that it was made to be. That was, I think, on the part of the policymakers at the time. They thought that this was the way to make it work. So I think even, for example, the sort of classes that were made available to the migrant population were oftentimes the English language and not the Maltese language, for example. The idea being that these people will come, learn a few skills maybe, and then move on. And I think clearly one of the realizations that happened in the country was that, in fact, while a number of migrants were in fact leaving the country, others were staying. And if they are staying, what's going to happen next, right? So how are we going to deal with issues? There was also the question of, well, the problems, let's put it that way, like the antagonism on the part of a significant, maybe, part of the population. I'm not saying majority, I don't think it ever was, but a sizable part of the population. And also some tensions possibly at the local level, within the communities and so on. The word integration I don't think was used much during that period of time, so that language is more recent. It did not come from government, it came from civil society, it came from UNHCR first, but it's the sort of language that government uses nowadays. And also, as everybody knows now, I hope, government has promised also to deliver an integration strategy. So that in itself, I think, is well, we've turned this around a lot. Clearly, by integration and who is integrating, different people understand different things. So we need to have a common definition in the country, I think, that we all use. And one way to go about that, in my opinion, is to stop the compartmentalization of different groups and communities. We have a very long list of titles that are given to different people. So you have EU nationals, third country nationals, persons who have refugee status, persons who have temporary humanitarian status, rejected status or whatever. And I think we should stop doing that. And in fact, in what we will be proposing, I quite like the theme of this event because we will be focusing on belonging, right? So the people who will be benefiting from the integration measures that we will be proposing would be the ones who want to, well, establish themselves here, who are in the country, who will not be leaving the country, and that, well, we want to create a space where all can belong and can feel secure as well. That's key.
Let's get to the nitty-gritty of an integration strategy perhaps later on. But one of the things that I'd like to take from what you were saying, Maria, earlier I introduced you as one of the people who were very active when the debate was very hot, and seeing where we are now today with what is essentially a government official, talking in this way on the basis of also an orientation that's been put on the table by the government itself. The implicit acceptance that this is here to stay and this is something we need to prepare wasn't there before. though at the height of the crisis, there was also always the idea that somewhere around the corner there was a silver bullet that's going to make this stop, and that this isn't a normal scenario, and it's something that we need to deal with extraordinary measures to just make it stop, rather than find the ways to mitigate and manage the situation better. Do you share this, or do you think that we're still way ahead, way behind from where we should be?
Matt, I agree on levels, but disagree on other levels.
Sure.
In 2005, so that's 12 years ago, I was just 10 at the time, I'd just like to put that out there. We had the first integration policy, and the title was The Integration of Irregular Migrants in Malta. It's no longer online, and it was obsolete before it was even published, quasi. But the title says a lot. The Integration of Irregular Immigrants in Malta. At the time, hardly anyone had any real understanding of what was going on, myself included. I remember working in the my first job was running the first open centre in Malta, the first government-led one. And I remember meeting people from Eritrea and Burkina Faso and saying, where is that? I've never heard of it. I mean, I was really ignorant. And so was everybody else. You know, it was a case of being thrown into the deep end. There was no AWAS at the time, there was no UNHCR office, there was no IOM office. There was JRS, a tiny office, and the Emigrants Commission. So even from an institutional perspective, very embryonic. And over the years, there has been developments. So despite that policy document in 2005 that listed, that actually named integration, I'd agree with you that nobody really meant it. They didn't even know what it meant. It was just one of those words that was thrown in because it was expected, but in what did it translate into? Very little. At a time where there were people still being detained for more than 18 months, if I recall. The transition from the detention to the open centre was an ugly one. The transition from the open centre into the community was even worse. Rampant racism at the time, whilst for sure it was the minority, it was heightened, and very little structures with, and here I'd agree, the onus being on, first of all, sort of a discourse of panic, that Malta's too small, that we're being invaded, and that all policy was essentially focused on people leaving, whether it was forced return, AVR, relocation, or US resettlement. I would say, though, that I think that one fed into the other, but certainly the asylum seekers that were arriving at the time, the majority had never heard of Malta, or if they had, it was from the Bible, ironically. And they felt that they hadn't reached mainland Europe, so were still very much on their journey. I mean, many of them arrived in Malta and thought they'd landed in Libya because of the language, and the detention centres. So a lot of things have changed. I would say, obviously, the fact that the boats are no longer coming in, we still have the same number of arrivals, really, of asylum seekers, but they're plane arrivals today, so you don't have that visual. So the degree of panic and the spectacular, if you like, has lessened. We've also moved on, and the fact that we know that an integration policy is imminent is great, you know, and this is something that we're really looking forward to. I'm not a lawyer. Today, I don't know where I stand on integration, to be honest. The EU define integration as a two-way process. But in discourse, it tends to put the onus on the migrant. If you look at the term inclusion, when you include someone, the onus is on yourself to include. So I personally am looking more at inclusion. To shift some of the responsibility. Interestingly, Sylvan, even us, we used to offer English lessons, and then the refugees asked for Maltese lessons. It never dawned on us to offer Maltese lessons. That was something that we were asked to do. So I think we were also part of this, you know, discourse of then they'll move on. I'm not a lawyer, and I think in the past I would have agreed to, you know, that let's forget categories, but not anymore. Because if people need to feel that they belong, and that needs more than just a sense of belonging. And it's those categories that should, in practice, ensure access to rights. So the refugee label is important because it gives you certain rights. The subsidiary protection and, of course, those who are rejected still have those human rights, and how will they, in the long run, be able to be part of our community, which I feel that after a certain amount of time, they can no longer face deportation. That imminent threat of deportation has to go, because people need to feel safe. And that's where the categories are important at that level, in terms of access to rights and protection.
Just to take a point on this, first of all, I'd like to know your opinion, Mohammed, about this point. Are categories important in this sense? But also, and I think it's also tied, in the last 2-3 years, maybe a bit more, we've seen the development of quite a few grassroots organizations, just like Spark 15. So in the first phase of the crisis, really and truly, it was Maltese people who were speaking on behalf of migrants. Now we're seeing migrants speaking on the behalf of migrants, which I think is a good thing. But is that a response to a need? As in, did those organizations develop because there is a need out there which wasn't being met by civil society, NGOs, as they were before?
Well, refugees felt that, especially youth refugees, felt like they need to represent themselves after a long time of local NGOs, which did a very good job. They felt like representing themselves, especially after the educated part of refugees start to be increasing. I think as well, if they give an authentic voice to this matter. I mean, when you speak about an issue and you're not including a person who's going through it, that authenticity won't be like believable. Or the policymakers will take it light.
Do you agree? And I'll give Silvan an opportunity to respond, because it's to something he said. Do you agree that the when we're looking at inclusion and integration, the categorization of different migrants is important? It's important to make a distinction that you know, a refugee and the person with humanitarian protection and the person who doesn't have this level of protection, or a legal migrant from a European member state, for instance. Do you feel that this is important?
It is for, especially if you're distributing, dividing people, you have to divide them in a legal way, not on the land. Like for example, you should equalize the rights, especially in employment and education. There should be no distinguish between them. Categorizing refugees will increase their some of them. Like for example, if you're distributing to categorizing two parts, one part will have more rights than the other, which is not good, especially if you're not equalizing the education and.
To an extent, that also comes out of the law, though. I mean, a refugee, by the nature of the status, has more rights than someone who doesn't have refugee status, by a migrant, a third country national who doesn't have refugee status. So.
Also, if I may add this, there's some status that is not, from a refugee point of view, which is not needed, such as the humanitarian status. It's just to keep the cheap labor increasing. Cheap labor is playing a very big part of the society. The more cheap labor is, the better. This term start to be well known between the locals as well in the past 4 years,
By humanitarian status, I'll put this to you.
Yes.
First of all, to
Yeah.
respond to that point, but also to explain a bit the situation
Firstly,
with regards to status.
I think-
After this, if you don't mind, I'd like to open to the floor for questions. So let's have.
Firstly, I think I explained myself badly in that I did not mean that categories don't matter. I meant we should not continue to entrench those differences through the use of the categories. For example, if one looks at, and this is somewhat technical, but if you look at the EU funding, for example, EU funding is usually there for third country nationals integration. That means to the detriment of those others who don't fall within that category. And I personally would have a hard time going by that. You know, it's easy to some degree for us to say, well, that's the sort of money that we have available and that's what we're going to do. But that is not fair, because that is leaving a substantial part of the migrant population in the country outside of any integration measures that would emanate out of, you know, the mechanisms and the systems put in place through that funding and so on. So that's what I meant. Of course, categories matter, you know, legal categories matter. In terms of, I missed the point now. Well, I beg to differ that the intention of the state is to create cheap labor. That I really don't believe that. That could be one of the results because of lack of, how to say, systems to protect people against such situations. But I don't think that was ever the intention of the state, or a consequence that would necessarily stay like that if we had a proper integration strategy. And by this I mean, if persons are able to function in a work environment in Maltese English, have the adaptation needed, have the right qualifications to obtain a job, not employing them would go against our existing anti-discrimination legislation and future anti-discrimination legislation that will be even more forceful than what we have at the moment. So I don't see why that would remain like that if we had this mechanism for integration in place. But of course, it's proving to be quite difficult to have all the different ministries respond to this integration strategy, also because it really involves all of government. It's not something that one department can do on its own, you know. So it's taking a long time in that sense for us to deliver it. We had hoped that it would already be in place. That was not the case. But the hope is that it will be in place soon enough and we can already start having people be enrolled into the system and benefit out of it.
I'd like to sort of take a round of three questions, and then we can.
Thank you very much. My name
Just
is,
introduce yourself briefly, please.
my name is Sari Albaga. I'm partner with Mohammed from Spark 15. And my question will go
Silva.
Sylvia, Mr. Sylvia. So you talked about sense of belonging. So is there any discussion in the integration about citizenship?
Let's have a round of questions first, and then,
Right.
and then we'll return to.
I think I have another question. I just lost it. Yeah. Wait.
People
Yeah,
always have
fair
two
enough.
questions. You can have your second question, huh?
Don't worry.
No problem.
It's important.
That sounds dangerous. I'm Emilia from Migrant Women Association. My questions are there too. And also regarding belonging, I'm wondering, how do you take into consideration the children, especially in a government school where there are a lot of classes with migrants and from any.
Yeah.
And the reality on the ground is that because they don't know the language or the teachers are not prepared how to handle such a multicultural class, the children are left behind and they're getting into a lower class, if I made myself understood. The other one, The other question is, what if, and I imagine that is not strange, what if the collaboration with Italy changes and there will be coming boats again to Malta? How do you address the Maltese society to be, I don't know, prepared for that? Thank you.
Another question, maybe? Yeah.
Noel Saguna with myself.
That's okay.
So regarding the title, because I thought that the title was about whether the EU is helping the southern countries rather than integration in the country itself.
It's not, it was changed.
Yeah, but just because we are no longer on the front line does not mean that the problem does not exist, especially on European level. So do we care about the other European states as much as we want them to care about us? So that was my first question, kind of comment. The second was, I want to ask, sorry, I don't know you, forgot your name, but you said that...
Miss Maria.
Maria. You said that rejectionists should not be deported. So if they are not deported, why have all this process? Just accept them, no? Thank you.
Okay. Fair enough. Before we turn to those questions, because I think that they're interesting questions, but they will take us in a different place. Let's sort of address this area where I feel there's also a theme there, which is, I mean, earlier you said, Selvan, you were talking about the state not actively not pursuing cheap labor, and I would tend to agree, but there is also in the Maltese system in general, and it's good that we talk about state, not government, because I think it's very systemic. There's a lot of status ambiguity and misinformation and inconsistency in the system that perpetuates these problems. So very often, first of all, we don't have a one-stop shop where a foreigner, any foreigner really, but migrants with certain needs can go and derive that information, and then those lacunas, those gaps of information tend to create a situation where there is very often injustice.
Yes, well, first, I need to make one thing clear. I am indeed the director of the Human Rights and Integration Directorate, but I don't represent all of government and all of its structures. So no, I don't. So I can only speak to what is my sphere of influence and what we do ourselves. I can also answer some of the questions that I know that other institutions are working on or do, but I cannot have the answers to all of the questions. For example, the citizenship question, I can quickly respond to. This is well beyond my power. There is a discussion on all sorts of fronts, so I'm not saying that there is no discussion about that, but having a discussion is one thing, having it listed as one of the things to do is another thing, all right? So just to be clear on such matters. And they are very sensitive for, I think, every country, and their issues of citizenship, long-term residence, and whatever else is very sensitive for Malta also, of course. No, sorry, I missed your point now, but I could respond.
No,
to
my point is tied to that in the sense of I mean, even with regards to education and how children are treated, there's a lot of status ambiguity and misinformation. Or
right. So in terms of children in schools, I know that there is a great effort by the Ministry of Education to prepare children actually for them to be able to follow classes in Maltese schools. A number of Maltese schools have great diversity within them, and indeed, yes, they're increasingly culturally diverse and linguistically diverse, which is in itself a challenge, but we also know that children actually link up and treat fellow pupils in the class usually very well. So there is no, and the younger they are, the less the problem. Surely you may have a different experience, but I don't know your particular experience. But what I'm told is that the schools, generally speaking, are functioning very well in this regard. You may tell me otherwise, we can discuss it, but so I know that there is a system in place at least anyway, and it is all gauged at preparing children to follow their education in multi-schools. This said though, we've had a significant increase in the number of pupils in multi-schools precisely because of the number of migrant pupils. And they come from all over. So many of them come from fellow EU member states, but not alone, right? And that, took the ministry by surprise. So the ministry had to respond to it in a way that it could. But I know that they sometimes, like during, because also this does not happen at the beginning of the scholastic year. It continues throughout the year, right? So pupils have to be integrated in a class that had already started, where they had not been part of it, in a school system that is very different than their home country, for example. Some pupils often, I can mention Italians, but they're not not only Italy, know very little of the Maltese language or English language, so they have a hard time also integrating that way. But anyway, so what I can say is that, of course, there are difficulties. Nobody, there's no way I will ever say that there are no difficulties, but I know that there are systems being put in place, brought up, yes, to address the gaps that we're identifying. Similarly, there is a structure in the Ministry of Health, for example, again, trying to iron out the difficulties that exist in that sector. When it comes to Identity Malta, I'm also told that the long waits that used to be in place before have significantly shrunk. Again, I'm not saying that there are no problems anymore, but the systems have significantly improved. Is that a good benchmark? I don't think so. And indeed, if you look at the MIPEX indicators and the placement of Malta on the MIPEX, one will quickly realize that we have much more to do. And this is where I'm hoping that the integration strategy will come in handy, in that it will look at the current situation and also project a future that is way better than what we currently have.
Maria, I'd like to
If I may interject, because I work in the Ministry of Education. So the feedback that actually...
I think he needs a mic.
Sorry. I'm sorry, but I work in the Ministry of Education, and so I think that I actually disagree a little bit with him on the fact that from the feedback that we have from the teachers, is that there is a very feedback. I mean, I work not exactly with policy and with education.
What's your role indeed?
My transport.
Transport?
Yeah.
So you have feedback as a transport official?
As in capacity of the schools. So for example, and we go around, and they were telling us, that they don't have space. For example, the people from sorry.
So you work in transport and you get feedback from teachers.
Not on the education.
Specifically on the integration.
No. On transport. So what my comment is that actually that the schools that they don't have the capacity, because there are lots and lots of students in the school, especially in St. Paul's Bay Primary School. It doesn't have so much space that they're going in Gargour, for example, and they are relocating students to Mjar, and from Mjar they're going to other places. So that was my
But that
my other
strengthens
comment.
what I just said. So what I said was that the Ministry of Education was taken by surprise by the number of migrant pupils that we're having in multi-schools. The numbers have shot up significantly. I remember this conversation that I had with the Minister for Education, where he was saying, at one point we were wondering whether we have way too many schools, and whether we should downsize maybe, yes, because we're having less and less children born every year, and maybe we did not need them, and all of a sudden we're thinking that we should build schools because we don't have enough. So things have changed a lot in that regard, but that is not a positive or a negative. That's reality. So we have, as a society, we have to adapt to that and be able to respond to that quickly. Because of course the pupils are in the school now, not in 5 years' time or 4 years' time, whatever. When we come up with the right responses. But well, unfortunately, Ray Facciol is not here, but he's the person who leads on the matter. And every time I have conversation with him, I see improvement. So I'm quite confident, in fact, that the Ministry of Education is one of the ministries that has done
I think
really well.
Your point is that they have it on their radar, and they're
Yes.
they're aware of it. I'd like to put to you one of the questions presented there, as a broader theme. When we talk about migrants who do not have status or have been rejected, have had their asylum application rejected. Now there is an argument to be made for people who have been in Malta for a very long time, but I think that point is a point that has a lot of currency and is a point to be made. If you accept everyone, what's the point of having an asylum process? And this ties also with the idea that the current situation may change tomorrow, may change in a month's time.
I want to first qualify, because I think I jumped down Sylvan's throat. I know that's not what you meant when you said about the categories. I just wanted to emphasize how important these categories are in terms of access to rights. But at the end of the day, I certainly don't want to be introducing Mo the refugee. I want it to be Mo, end of, that it's human beings that we're talking about. But I do disagree on the citizenship issue. It's not so hot an issue when we sell it for 600,000 euros. So citizenship is open to some and not open to others, just to flag that one. And I would agree as well that Ray Facciol and his team are doing, wonders, and whilst there are many challenges in the education, they certainly seem to be very determined to address it, and they've always been very open to us, which is fantastic as well. Mela, I didn't say rejected asylum seekers shouldn't be deported. What I said was that rejected asylum seekers should not face ongoing deportation. That becomes inhumane. We have an asylum system. In order for the asylum system to function, there are those who will go through the asylum process and there are those who will not be accepted under the existing categories. 1951 Geneva Convention, subsidiary protection. We also have THP, and there's questions about the THPN. We have a situation in Malta now where there are people who applied for asylum years ago, and were rejected, including Somalis and Eritreans and Ethiopians, who will never, as the situation stands, will never be returned to their country of origin, because and Syrians now as well, because even if they are rejected, the irony or the paradox, if you like, is we're saying, no, you're not really from Somalia, but we are going to return you to Somalia, which is essentially impossible, so they're stuck here in limbo. The onus of return is on the government. Now, in a functioning system, I would agree that some people may have to be returned. I'm going to do an asterisk on to return to that one a little bit later on. But when you have people who have been living here 10 years, 20 years, who are living with a rejected status in a constant limbo, that becomes inhumane when it is impossible to return them. It is impossible to return them. At some point, they need security, and if we're going to speak about an inclusive society, we need a security for them as well. Some of them with children. Some of them with children who identify as being Maltese, who speak better Maltese than I do as a Maltese person. So yes, I think at some point we do need to say, no, these people need to be regularized. They need to feel secure. Many of them, I was speaking to someone yesterday, He's been here 10 years, he's been paying tax and national insurance for 6 years. He is ultimately facing deportation. Is this fair? Is it fair to always be in limbo and in the end not be able to return this individual to the country of origin? So something needs to be done. Issa, if we look at contemporary forced migration flows, we have the asylum process. But many of the people that are leaving sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East today would not necessarily qualify for protection. The only reason why they take this route is because there isn't the legal option. There isn't the legal alternative. So whilst, yes, we need to protect the asylum process, we also need to open safe and legal travel for everybody, and not just the privileged few, which would include the European Union citizens. I remember someone telling me once years ago it would have been easier for me to go to Mars than to get a visa to Europe. And if you look, just Google access for Syrians, visa access for Syrians in the world, you'll come up with, there'll be an image that will come up, essentially with the globe in red of all the countries that Syrians cannot travel to. It is impossible for them to travel in a legal way. Impossible, impossible. Imagine if we were to be invaded today and you are unable to leave the island, that nobody would allow you to travel in a legal way. You will resort to an illegal way or an irregular way as per the international protection. So it's very, very complex. I definitely didn't say rejected shouldn't be returned. I said within a certain period of time, particularly, but I don't even want to say particularly because then the most vulnerable can't work, but when you have those that have been paying tax and national insurance, which we take, which feeds into our system, which we take willingly, no, their rights need to be secured. And then you have others like women, some women, persons with a disability who can't work and cannot remain with no safety nets. That is inhumane. It is inhumane, and it is a detriment to them and to broader society. In terms of the title change, is not an either-or. I mean, we need to speak about integration, but of course we need to speak about the situation in the European Union. I was in Lesbos last week. It's disgraceful. The common European asylum system that never was imploded. It was always collapsing. Now it imploded. There is no solidarity amongst the member states. You have 28, soon to be possibly 27 member states, each looking after their own, pulling the barriers up. And if you look at the situation in Turkey, it's just getting worse and worse and worse. And at the same time, we claim to be on the side of human rights. So of course, we should be talking about that, but it's not either or. We need to be speaking about integration too.
Okay, I'd like to welcome Najm Arba from the Sudanese Migrants Association. Thank you for being with us, and I'm sorry for your. That's okay. That's okay. So I'd like to put this to you. So before you came, we were discussing some of the challenges faced by migrants and refugees in Malta, and how things changed really over the past years. And my question to you, also tying in a bit what we're discussing right now, we were sort of touching upon some of the problems that emerge from lack of information and the lack of a channeled system where migrants and refugees know exactly what their rights are, like, say for instance to apply for long-term residency, for instance, and know where they have to go and know how things work. Even sometimes in the educational system, we were discussing some problems, for instance, before this debate that some migrants have with regards to education, even at MCAST level. I don't know if you'd like to interject on that.
Firstly, allow me to apologize for being late. It is a great honor to be here with you, stand in the panel and listen to the nice discussion that we're going to be. Actually, the topic is very great, and it is fantastic to come together and discuss issues related to migration and stuff like that. As being a student at MCAS, there are many difficulties that migrant students actually face. Some of them, they are lack of documentation and even the funding and the accommodations issue. But recently, if I bring examples, friends of mine in my class, he dropped from class because he applied for exemption from his fee and his case get rejected. Why? Because his status temporary protection. Is it fair? I don't think so. This is just one example. It's many examples as well. When we go through to ID card systems, we find many difficulties when migrants apply for their residence, and they have to wait more than 3 months to get it, and they will be valid until 6 months. So you will have it 3 months, and then it's unvalidated. This one issue, but the most important, I think, when it's come to integration, it is like a long process, and it is not from one part. They have to be willing from the migrant community and government as well. And the government, they play the various role here. Why? Because since I know that I am not living here in Malta permanently, or I'm just holding a subsidiary protections, and under any cases might be validated, then the will of integration will not be like you have a permanent residency and stuff like that. So I think from the government, they have to apply a strong and solid project for the integration, so that all refugees can find themselves. When they come to apply, they feel that they need to be integrated, not just filling a paper and waiting for documentation. I will add more, but I will give the space to the panel.
Very interesting points, thank you. I'd like to take this because unfortunately the time is running, so we need to sort of gel it together at this stage. But I'd like to take this point as something we can reflect on in the closing phase of the discussion, which is this idea of the integration policy that's being drafted. I think there are a lot of hopes and aspirations being pegged on it. The question is this a project which is going to be as wide as what we're discussing here? Because what we're discussing here goes into the fabric of so many different areas. And one thing which we've sort of touched upon now, but aren't really addressing directly, is society. So there's a societal element, as Najm said. It's a tango that needs to have both sides on it. So it's not just a case of where the government stands and where the migrants stand, but also where society stands. And I think it's fair to say that society isn't consistently comfortable on the subject. So I'd like at this stage to bring you to, maybe we take another round before we start concluding. Do you feel that Maltese society, from your experience, is ready for this next step, if this is what it is?
Society are always ready, especially from what I can see since 2011, since 2013. They are ready, especially the youth, the local youth. They are ready, and when you spoke about society, I was reading this book. I forgot his name. The title was Reality and Society. So it says that statistics says that society faces a new reality every 30 years, and the more that the society is prepared for the new reality, the more positive it will be. Like for example, the first boat arrived in 2001, theoretically, and today we are in 2000, let's say 18. So we have almost 12 years for the new reality. So if we start working alongside the society and give more opportunities for the youth, both from both sides, from the local and from the migrant youth, it will be a more positive reality than now. The process is working very, very slow. I've heard that the integration policy has been started since 2008, which is 9 years from now. The more we work, the more you include people, the faster the policy will be finalized.
Yeah. There's a lot of hope pegged onto the integration policy. Does it have a hope to sort of tackle all of these aspirations, or would it be something a bit more limited? And what can we do to then take this discussion to the next level if the integration policy
Yes.
is not going to?
Well, the integration strategy that we're developing and the list of actions that come along with it, we are working to include all government in it, all right? So we've been having meetings with all the ministries. Not a single ministry is out of this. And the reason for that is that we want it to be a basis, a framework on which to build further measures in the future. It would be silly, I believe, to have an integration strategy restricted to some ministries and not others, because migrants, like all of us, use all the services and have the same needs, after all, as the local population. So from that angle, I think that there should be high expectation indeed, and if we would fail if we deliver something more restricted. Of course, as I said earlier, it's not only up to my directorates to come up with the proposals, but it's also for the various institutions also to honor them after that. And but I do have hope in terms of multi-society. I think when we when we conducted some research a couple of years ago, the responses we got were a lot more positive than what people believed. And the thing is, if you go through the comments on online news articles, you will believe that, well, this is a hopeless society, right? There's nothing that you can do because people don't want integration. But in actual fact, if you look around you in the street, if you look at the employment patterns, if you look at the one statistic where out of every 2 jobs that are created, 1 is taken on by a non-Maltese person, then you realize that this society is heading, as you said earlier, towards a much diversity. And we need to manage the diversity, because otherwise it will start working against our needs. And by our, I don't mean Maltese people, all of us. So we need to, yes, have solutions quick. Are we working to have those solutions quick as a society? That's a more tricky one, I think. There's a lot of expectation on government, but are we, all of us, contributing our part? How are the various local councils, for example, part of this? Are they not? The institutions, the local government, are we as a society really moving in that direction, or is it just this one expectation that government somehow has to come up with the one solution that is just the right? And there, I think there's a lot of work to be done.
I'd like to take one last round of questions. Just raise your hands and
So back again to sense of belonging and citizenship. So I believe personally that if there is no citizenship included, there is no sense of belonging, because that will be changed to enhancing the right of the migrants, not sense of belonging. In terms of citizenship, you will enjoy the total freedom of any other citizen. And one of them is, for example, myself, I'm working in biometrics, and I'm not eligible for pension in the future, which is not fair, to be honest, because I'm still paying for it. So that's a part of sense of belonging. And integration, I would like to have just a brief, how can I say it? Identify for me what is the integration in this policy. What do you exactly mean with it? Is it society to migrant, or migrant to society, that we need to comply with the law and orders, or community to migrants and migrant to community? Thank you.
let's have all the questions. Introduce yourself, please.
Yeah, my name is Abdullah Hassan from Somali community in Malta. My question is, when we're talking about the integration, as far as we know, the country doesn't have specific courses for the refugees and the migrants who arrive newly in the country. So someone who come from a country who don't speak English or the Maltese language, and came here to Malta and can't find a local courses, how can they make integration? Because if you compare the majority of the European countries, when they accept someone as a part of the community, they give some courses, which is the local language, which is some skills that they will work later on. In Malta, we don't have all that system. So if and when you see the majority of our population, they are struggling with the communication. So if they find, most of them, they are ready to work and they are very keen to help the country and to help with their families. So, what making tight for their hand it is the language barrier. So is there any strategy to make some courses, English courses or Maltese courses, and then after that to give some skills, so to don't give only those who the country take as a refugee or as a citizen of protection. So all those who are part of those who arrive here as irregularly, as we say. That's one question. And my second point is the Maltese, to make just a comment, is the Maltese people are ready to accept it for the refugees. I have been here a long time. I think since 2013, that election of 2013 changed so many things. There was a lot of hope that the Maltese population will make some contribution when they're talking about the refugee. They were looking as a more positive, but the election of 2013 it makes more negative because of the pushback, because of the what many politicians they were saying, and the people and the majority of the people they take it for the negative of that. And I think from that year it goes more down, and it will come up maybe the future. And if we talk about the children who was born here in Malta and still living here in Malta, but it happened that their parents are refugee or subsidiary protection, still they don't have nothing. Suppose they have to be a Maltese because they was born here as the Maltese they was born here. So is there any sense that they can be a refugee? Is that something right? And I think it's not right.
Last question. Mary.
Hi, Mireille from UNHCR. I work in the Durable Solutions unit, and integration, of course, for us is a durable solution, a long-term solution for refugees. My question perhaps is, of course, I mean, whatever we said, we are very much in touch, and we have seen development also in Malta since we've been here working on these issues for a number of years now, and I'm not going to repeat the various topics and interesting points that were made. I will just ask from another perspective, which I think still makes it's still linked very much with what we have been discussing. For example, that there are still institutional hurdles for real integration, including citizenship, naturalization, family unification. But let's take it from the public perspective. Is in this integration framework, is there something addressing like a public campaign where the government would want to send out the message that integration is positive, that social inclusion is positive? Because as we know, then if these messages come from the ministers, from the government, and as Abdullahi said, this has been a factor in 2013, for example. And of course, positive messages on this will also affect the population mentality and, of course, the way how they work. And after all, the population, the way how the population thinks also affects then the votes that are actually then the politicians take. And of course, we know that laws change because there would be general consensus on a matter. So that is my question, basically, like whether you have included like a public campaign or something pro social inclusion, integration as part of this integration strategy. Thank you.
Okay. I'll let the panel take this, but we'll sort of do it in an ordered fashion, and I'll give Silvan the last word because he seems to be the
yes.
in everyone's crosshairs.
As expected, as expected.
Start, Emily.
I can't remember everything that was said, to be honest, but I'm going to just reflect on 2 points. Integration, inclusion is very, very complex. It's impossible to look at, as if this is it or this is it, because it's very complex. But I remember when we started the US resettlement program, and the first refugees were accepted to go to America, and they were so excited. I remember saying, "You've been accepted," and literally being thrown into the air. They were so excited to be going to America. But quite soon afterwards, word started to get back that America was really tough, The land of hope and dreams was really, really difficult. It was not going to be easy for the refugees in America, but but people still wanted to go to America. And I remember actually going with refugees to America on one occasion, and what they told me was, we know it's going to be really, really difficult, but our children will be American. And this was everything. Access to citizenship, it's not a case of should be, that you can there are different countries. Some countries say if you are born there, some if you have a bloodline to nationality. Malta is bloodline, basically. But I would agree with you that ultimately inclusion means citizenship. A lobby is powerful with votes, and as long as people don't have votes, they ultimately do not have the same amount of power or say in the way a community and a nation operates. And I'll finish on just to kind of demonstrate the importance of this sense of security. Yesterday, I think it was yesterday or this morning, I was reading an article, I can't remember, but it was on EU citizens living in the UK, professionals. They were interviewing professionals who, doctors, nurses, teachers, architects, some of them had been living there for years. And I think one of them, she said, I'm devastated, but she was making plans to leave the UK. For 2 reasons. First, because in terms of discourse, she no longer felt welcome. And importantly, she had no idea, these are EU citizens, professionals, they had no idea what their future was going to look like. And that sense of insecurity was just too much, and they were deciding to go back. But they're EU citizens. The majority, by no means all, if you look at people from Greece, Spain, especially young people, not all of them can go back because there's nothing to go back to. But in the case of a refugee or someone who, for whatever reason, felt compelled to leave their home, even that insecurity is not enough to go home because there is no security at home. So it's not just about just throwing that word out there, citizenship. It's about what it implies and the sense of security and the implications for what that means on a day-to-day level of feeling safe, for really feeling safe, cannot be underestimated.
If I may, Mohammed, I'd just like to take one of these points on the point of sense of belonging. I think you are very representative of a generation of young refugees who, at least outwardly, don't let me define you, but just take it as a question and do with whatever you like. I feel that you represent a group of people who have already a sense of belonging, even though despite the number of problems with the Maltese system. I mean, you speak Maltese, and you have a social network that works. You're in the education system and you have goals. That to me is the definition of belonging to a particular place. Do you feel that, or am I mistaken in my assessment? And where does it come from?
Well,
What's working?
First, I totally agree with you. As a refugee, I'm from the third generation of as a refugee. My father was born as a refugee. My grandfather fled Eritrea since a long time ago. So here in Malta, the belonging, I felt it more here, to be honest. I have no idea how Eritrea looks like. Here in Malta, like 95% of my friends are locals, and I learned English here in Malta. I had no idea about English when I arrived, and there is many youth that are being refugees since they were born, who's living here. Perfect example is Horia Tafij, a former president of Spark. She's the fourth or fifth generation as a Palestinian refugee. Malta can be home for all young refugees, but not Malta today. Malta today is very tough, especially when the integration process is working very slow. We're losing talents and skills. A good example is a former member of Spark. He used to be a very good football player, and he flew Malta like he flew.
He left Malta.
Yeah, he actually flew. He went to Germany. Now he's getting paid to play. The Germans don't even look at you if you don't play. So there is a waste of talents and skills. Refugees being gaining scholarships outside, while University of Malta has only 8 refugees. While University of Malta has only 8 refugees out of 12,000. There is refugees are willing to integrate when they feel welcome from the society and the government. First, the society.
Najim, similar point, I would say, unless we want to deal with something else. I'd like to sort of end on this note of belonging. Even I'll put the same sort of theme to Silvan as he answered a series of other questions.
Before I answer these questions, I just want to mention that we have forgot the media. Media is the most powerful weapon that we can use. And unfortunately, during the last 10 years, it was using very bad ways and always reflecting the bad image of the refugees and bad representation. Refugees are always willing to integrate, but if you go to your home and open your television watching a TV program like Sharp Bank or what it is, then even if you have something in your mind, then you will confuse. When we took individual examples, every refugee, he worked in his place, he got very good relationship with his employee and his staff, he worked with them. They can even invite them to home and participate with them during individuals when we talk. But when it takes to the general, and then actually general things, it means that everything that have a policy. And if the government pumped a policy of integration, a solid project that will allow people to integrate this society and the refugees themselves, they will be more wishing for them. Back to the point of sense of belonging, I think most of the refugees, if I'm not talking from myself, they don't have that sense. And why don't have that sense of belonging? Because they don't feel Malta as to call it home. There is many issues that we wanted to see alive, but when they go through the channels that, or even when they are digging their way to make Malta home, they find some difficulties. Example I brought previously, my friend, he's a good student, he's a talent as well. He's finishing his national advanced diploma and he's going to upgrade the study, but because of the financial support or the lack of documentation he got in Malta, he got to stop his progress. And this is the waste of talent, as Muhammad previously said. He fled to France, now he completed his education. Malta in need to those people. If we look to the Maltese population, refugees are, if you just search around them, you find many talent. They are willing to make Malta home. But the first, they have to be accepted from the government, from the society. From individual, they don't have any problems. If I talk about myself, I have very range of Maltese friends, families, and a lot. But when it's come to the policy, I argue the policy here, it doesn't include anyone. But previously, or not previously, I hope that the government should adopt a solid project that allow any refugee, before integrate, feel and sense that he will and have that will to be integrated. Thanks.
Very often when we discuss migration in general, we tend to take the perspective of the migrant, in good and in bad. The people who are sympathetic to migrants argue that the system is not fair or can be improved in their regard. The people who are not sympathetic to migrants argue that we're being maybe too generous and open borders and so on and so forth. This last point I want to make it from the perspective of the state, from the perspective of the government, but more the state. You're a policy man, so I think you'll appreciate this perspective. What they're describing here is seen from the perspective of the state. Bad policy. It's bad utilization of a resource, in this case human resources. A football player in a country which never managed to conclude anything spectacular in football goes to another country and finds an opportunity there. A young person who's willing to educate himself leaves Malta and finds employment elsewhere. Back in the day when I was a reporter, I remember interviewing an Iraqi refugee Nigerian refugee who obtained refugee status, was shipped to the US, and this person was a very high-ranking roads engineer who was involved in a swathe of projects in his country. Again, in a country which can do with that sort of expertise.
That's way bigger than any integration policy, I think. Because if you think about it, you need to pose the same questions about the Maltese youth who leave the country to work elsewhere. You need to think about other EU youth who are thinking of relocating and may have considered Malta but then opted for another country. So that sort of question, I think, is way bigger than what we're discussing tonight. And I have a hard time answering it in a brief period of time. And also, I think I actually would not have all the answers to what you just said. But I agree with you that it's a shame that those people who had already invested into being in the country, into learning maybe the language, into fitting in their community, finally have to decide to uproot themselves and move elsewhere because the prospects in the country for them are bleak. So from that point of view, I fully understand and empathize with the people in question. And I would hope indeed, yes, that as a country we would find solutions in this regard that are long-term, that actually encourage people who have integrated to some degree or another in the country to integrate further and really feel the sense of belonging that I launched as, it will be the theme of the strategy anyway. And I agree with you that you cannot belong in a country if there are not the systems in place, right? But indeed, then that justifies our continued work to have a strategy that is as holistic as possible. And yes, Abdullah, it will address the question of education. Education is key. And while there are some courses that migrants in the country can follow, like lifelong learning classes or whatever. I don't think that that is the way to go, and I don't think that they answer the needs of the migrant community. So ultimately, those may supplement a system that we could have, but they cannot be the system, right? So yes, as a way forward, we need to discuss everything. I don't think we should have any taboos in this field. We should also have solutions that are durable, of course, and we need to come up with a system that is not government-centered, but I think has focuses, because otherwise the response will never match the need. And I think it's ultimately, it goes down to the individual. I mean, how we as individuals open up to migrants in our community also, and how much we are ready to assist and facilitate their process of integration. Now, is integration one way from the migrant? No, it is not. It's definitely for each and every one of us to contribute our part. And we don't speak of, one-way or two-way integration. We speak of interculturalism, if you will. And we really would like to see that everybody contributes their part and we all take something back from this process of integration. Will we see it happen through the strategy, I don't think it's a strategy focused this is our experience of living together, our experience of sharing the space, our experience of having debates like this one of tonight, and learning from one another. Is the situation better now or worse now? I would tend to believe that it's a lot better now than it used to be, but of course, you are the migrant, you have maybe a better understanding.
We are denying the situation is coming better, but I mean, when that election of 2013,
yes,
money encouraging things that have
true.
Been done, starting from the point that Maria Regina, she now wasn't the me because she was starting.
I think if to put the point on it, I think what he's referring to is the government's the incident where the government had tried to push back migrants had given a new kick to xenophobic sentiment around the country.
Because the work of the politician, it can make more changes for the perception of the community of the Maltese people. So if the politicians they campaign against us, there will be more people they will be against us. If the members of the politics they will accept us and they will address our good things, the people will have a positive things for us. So that election make something that again is.
Yes, look, I see your point, but I also believe that a few other things have happened as well, like the centers are pretty much closed, so we don't have detention centers anymore. In the media, for example, the Times of Malta, I mentioned them because I had mentioned them on other occasions where I was more critical, does not allow some articles to have the usual the comments that we used to see before, for example. So that's a new policy of halting some of this negativity, for example. The fact that there are so many migrant-led organizations this day, for me, is again another clear sign of things changing and, there being a push, if you will, from different parts of society towards a process of integration. So I really hope that what will come out now, and I can only speak about, what we have in hand, it's not the final product, will lead to further improvements, and that there will be more offshoots coming out of it for the better of everybody.
I'm gonna have to close it here. I'm sorry. On that note.
So that question is part of the integration policy. Is there any lobbying or there's any?
Public campaign.
Yeah. Okay.
A public campaign would
Half
have
a
to be a
minute,
part
Silva.
of it. Yes, it has to be a part of it, of course. Otherwise, it cannot work. This is the case for any strategy, so definitely.
Okay. On that note, we can continue for another couple of hours probably, but we won't do that. we'll have to do it some other time. I'd like to thank Debating Europe and the European Commission's Europe for Citizen program, which financed this debate. Hopefully we'll have others in the future. I'd like to thank the panel. I think it was a very useful and interesting discussion, and thank you for your participation. Thank you very much and good evening.